You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're going to be talking about Edward Hopper. Now, my guest today, I am really excited because I always love to get to talk to people smarter than I am. And Julie Averbach graduated from Yale, of all places, with a BA in art history as well as psychology. Am I right there?
That's right.
And the author of the upcoming book, The Art of Trader Joe's, which once I saw that title, I was like, I have to meet you and learn so many things because I was hooked once I saw like art in everyday places. And looking through the book, there is so much art in Trader Joe's. I was absolutely astonished.
Thank
You're bringing that accessibility to art. And that actually, in this probably my longest intro ever, brings me to where I first stumbled across you. I don't even know how I saw this. I think it was just like my insecurity and like probably had a Google alert for like who else has ridiculous art puns in their names on social media. I saw a while back you were doing virtual tours of museums.
Yes, that's right. I'm still hosting virtual tours.
Yes. So I will put a link in the show notes, despite the fact that I guess we're officially somewhat competitors. But but the Smarty museum tours have done a lot to bring people together through the pandemic. You created these virtual tours starting, was it 2020?
That's right. Yes. So starting in July of 2020, I decided to translate my experiences in studying art history to curating these live virtual art museum tours, mainly for older adults, as a way of making museums more accessible and promoting positive mental health during that time. So it's an ongoing project, and I'm so glad to connect with you because I think we have a lot in common.
Yeah. And like I say, the website is smarty.biz, and that's smart biz. So, I love that you were doing that. And it actually also is seemingly somewhat perfect for our talk today on Edward Hopper and his work, because it was so much about sort of social interaction or lack thereof that he was experiencing, the isolation, those feelings that, we all experience at some point, and certainly we're experiencing in 2020, although he was, I guess, about 100 years ahead of us. So now I think we probably should get into that work. Edward Hopper was born in Nyack, New York. It's sort of a smaller town on the Hudson River. Everything I've seen, it seems like a beautiful place to grow up. The town, I think, was built, like the big industry was like building yachts and stuff like that. I mean, it just feels so perfect for like New York growing up, yachts. And I just imagine, something out of like the movies with East Coast elites and everything like that. And that lifestyle. Although he was not an elite by any stretch of the imagination. He's growing up. He was showing an interest in art, and his parents encouraged that. For a while, he thought about naval architecture, but then, because he did love sailing, but he ended up studying design and illustration, art in sort of more traditional sense. But one of the things that I read was that when he was like just 12 years old, he was 6 feet tall, and that's really tall for a 12-year-old.
That's staggering to think about.
And he said like that just made him feel so separate and apart from everyone else. And when you have that like shy, quiet, introverted disposition to begin with. And then you're also just like so physically different from your peers. And for me, as a teacher who I teach K-5 students, and I see those fifth graders who are approaching that age, and I just think of like how that is the most awkward time of your life in even the best of circumstances, and how
True.
awful that must have been. And like I say, 100 years later, I'm here talking about how freakish he looked at 12 years old. So I feel like a little bit bad that I'm somewhat bullying someone who was experiencing that as a child. But like, they called him grasshopper. He, just felt like he was all limbs, I guess, stretched out and uncomfortable with his body and his appearance, and his peers made that even worse. And I think the reason that I'm bringing that up is not so much because I want to dunk on somebody about their body. It's more just the fact that this really, I think, played a part in shaping him and his lens and the way that he went through the world. I mean, it's one of those childhood traumas, if you will, that it seems like he never quite got over.
It sounds like an alienating experience.
Yeah, I mean, he talked about it throughout interviews. So he grows up, obviously, he continues on, he's studying art. He went to the New York School of Art, which I found this interesting. It was originally the Chase School. And that was obviously the namesake, William Merritt Chase, a reasonably prominent artist, American artist at that time. And that's who he was studying under. So he's directly studying under the founder of the school and learning from William Merritt Chase along with Robert Henry or Henri, maybe. I don't know. It's kind of the French spelling, but it's an American artist. Anyone who's been listening for a while doesn't expect me to get pronunciation right. But he was studying art in New York. The thing I find kind of interesting, or I was surprised by when I did the research on this, was that as he studied art and his early career was in illustration, he really didn't like illustration. And that to me was surprising just because like his work has such that illustrative and narrative quality to it as I look at it.
I agree. Yeah, I think that his parents, although they were supportive to some extent of his desire to be an artist, they encouraged him to pursue commercial art and illustration because they believed it was more marketable and a better way for him to earn a living. And so he was initially an illustrator and sort of resented that, and always had an aspiration of being a painter. But I think that he really honed his skills in that period where he was more focused on illustration, and especially in terms of his compositions and his treatment of light, that he learned a lot through those experiences that he then adapted in his paintings.
Yeah. And, when you think about it, like from a parent's perspective, it makes perfect sense to say like, only a very, very small sliver of the population that attends art school is going to make it big as a studio artist exhibiting in galleries and stuff like that. I mean, it's like going out and saying, I want to be a CEO. Like, of course, that would be nice. But for the most part, you can't count on that. You're probably going to be middle management, and that's perfectly fine, and that's acceptable, and that's a way to earn a living. And I don't know, I was surprised that he was so disdainful of the illustration because of the fact that, like I said, I see that reflected so much in his work. Like I see that as shaping his style in a lot of ways. But that's what he was doing up until what was it? Like his early 40s is when sort of the shift happened. I mean, he was making paintings, but they weren't really selling all that well. As an adult, he studied in New York. Hopper spent pretty much like the bulk of his life in New York. I mean, he was born in essentially the suburbs of New York City and then spent his adult life in New York City. He did study and keep up with trends in the art world more broadly, but from what I understand, he wasn't that impressed with the European avant-garde. I think I saw somewhere he was quoted as saying something like, Picasso, yeah, I think I've heard of him. Not the exact quote, but something to that effect. Like, he was New York through and through.
Right. And I mean, Hopper has a really interesting perspective on New York City because he was living in New York at a time, especially in the 1920s and 30s, where we see skyscrapers and high rises going up, and the city is rapidly changing. But Hopper isn't swept up in all of that change. He's not painting the Empire State Building or these grand attractions that we think of when we think of New York. He's painting the cafe, the office building, the diner. He's painting these everyday relatable kinds of places and giving us this slice of life perspective of what it means to live in New York through a more intimate kind of observer's eye.
It's almost like small town New York. You know what I mean? Like, if you told me that, his some of his paintings, if you told me that these cityscapes were Main Street in a small town, in upstate New York, I'd buy it. Like Nighthawks Diner, I don't see more than 2 stories on any building within there. It's an empty city street. Like I could see this being in a lot of different places. And that's kind of interesting how the city, I mean, we all think of New York as so big and imposing, and he gives it this cozy feel sometimes. It's weird. Why is he doing that?
I mean, it's interesting. As someone who lives in New York, I think that when you live in New York, you get to know your neighborhood and your area. You start to have, your favorite cafe, your favorite restaurant, your favorite bookstore, and you have this more intimate sort of perspective on the city. And that's what I get from Hopper's painting. This isn't someone who spent a weekend as a tourist visiting the city, but someone who's lived there for years and is observing all of the little details of it.
Yeah. And I think he spent most of his adult life in like a little walk-up apartment. Was it Greenwich Village?
That's right. Yeah, I think
right?
Washington Square Park. Mm-hmm.
It was around, I think, the age of 42-ish that he met Jo, his wife. And that was kind of a turning point in a lot of ways because she had some success as an artist herself. She was an artist in her own right, and she helped to introduce him around to people in New York in that scene. And if I recall correctly, I got to look this up. I feel like it was a Brooklyn museum maybe that she introduced the curator. You're nodding. You know the details, don't you?
It sounds familiar. I mean, I think that Jo really was an advocate for Edward Hopper, and that meeting Jo was something that propelled his career forward in a lot of ways, as you're saying. And Jo was a really well-regarded artist in her own right. She was a watercolorist. She was very well known for her bright and bold colors and loose brushwork. And at the time that she and Edward Hopper married in the 1920s, she was exhibiting her work in shows alongside Pablo Picasso and Man Ray and artists that we tend to put up on a pedestal today. So I think, we can consider how Jo and Edward Hopper influenced one another as artists who lived and worked side by side for most of their lives. Jo did play an active role in advocating for Edward Hopper, especially considering that he was more of an introvert himself, in making connections and helping his work to get sold in the art world. She was also a record keeper. She kept really meticulous ledger books with details about all of his artworks, when they were sold, where they were exhibited. And she was also a muse and a model for him. So she was his primary model. And whenever you see a woman in an Edward Hopper painting, most likely it was based on Jo.
Yeah.
So she wore all these different hats in how she supported his success. So I think that is a really important part of the story, and I'm glad we're talking about it.
Oh, yeah, because I think their relationship, I think, was really interesting because you can read it in so many different ways. And I think this is so sort of perfect for his work because I think there's a parallel here between his relationship and the relationship you see in the couples and the groupings in his work. Because on the one hand, you hear that she was this champion of his work. She was introducing him around. I mean, I've read accounts that say that she introduced him to a curator who sort of like bought the first piece that went into a museum when he had his first sellout show in the 1920s. You know, he has a sellout show and he's just like, he's done with the whole illustration thing and dedicates himself to painting. And it sounds like, wow, so beautiful. And then I was reviewing clips of interviews and stuff like that, and you hear her talking and she's just like, well, I don't think men are particularly great at expressing gratitude, and that's more of the woman's thing. And it's just like, he never thanked her, gave her credit for her contributions to his success. I mean, there's a very large part of me that gets very angry when I think about the dynamic between them. And I don't want to be putting my own, 21st century lens on, them. And, I obviously don't know the ins and outs of the couple, but from all the accounts that I've seen, it was a really volatile relationship. Like you said that pretty much any woman in there, Jo was the model, right?
Yes.
The accounts that I've read said that was largely because she was a very jealous person and did not want another woman sitting for him. And he also served as his own model in some stuff. In Nighthawks, which we're going to get to later, she's the model, he's the model. Like it's all about them in a lot of ways. And I think it's interesting because they would fight and they would argue and they would go days without talking to each other. But on some level, there must have been some core of connectedness because they did stick together, and she did continue to champion his work and she did continue to document his work. And I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about their relationship. I feel like I'm mansplaining Edward Hopper and Jo to you, and I feel like that I want to give you a chance to share any thoughts you have.
No, I agree. I mean, it was a tumultuous and difficult relationship in a lot of ways. I think that, Jo made a lot of sacrifices when you think about how promising the start to her artistic career was. And then that she, ended up, after she married Hopper, really going into more of a supportive role and diving deep into kind of being an advocate for him. So it is a really complex relationship. And I don't mean to minimize any of the hardships that they face, but I do think that it's a good thing that we are now casting a light on Jo Hopper and her contributions, and also thinking about how she preserved his legacy. I mean, at the end of Hopper's life and her life, she bequeathed a lot of his artwork to the Whitney Museum, which has been a really important kind of institution in preserving Hopper's artwork. And so despite the, challenges that they faced as a couple, I think that she played an important role as an artistic collaborator and in preserving his legacy.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting when you start to think about how many stories are sort of similar to that. Like, I start to connect to like thinking about how Vincent van Gogh's legacy was because of his sister-in-law, really. And you think about Lee Krasner and how much she did to support Jackson Pollock. Despite, again, she was a very talented artist in her own right. And I think she gets a little bit more credit, historically speaking, than Jo has in a lot of this stuff, but still, it is interesting how a lot of times there is this dynamic where someone has to take on a supportive role, and I kind of want to scream at Edward because I feel like he was not equally supportive of her. I've read accounts that say that he was really dismissive of her talents. But who knows? Because again, it's one of those things. You're outside, you don't know. But I think getting back to my original point, it's interesting how you pick up these individual threads, and it's much like his works, where kind of what you see in that relationship is almost as much about you and what you bring to the picture as it is about what's in front of you. I see a lot of people will compare it to sort of set design and in cinematographers who are figuring out the like symbolism of every individual piece that's put within the composition. And I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison because Edward Hopper absolutely loved the cinema himself. And so there's this weird cycle and feedback loop because a lot of filmmakers love Hopper and Hopper loved the film. And so you see pieces that were inspired by his paintings, like a Hemingway story that was in part the inspiration for Nighthawks, was then adapted to a film, and for that they based it a little bit on the Nighthawks, the scene. You're nodding. Am I right in that?
I think so. I had read about the Hemingway story. And the influence really goes both ways, too, because Hopper in some ways inspired filmmakers, like his 1925 painting, A House by the Railroad, which was, fun fact, the first painting to ever be acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
Really?
Yes. And that painting inspired Alfred Hitchcock and his set design for the Bates Mansion in the film Psycho. So not only was Hopper a lover of cinema and theater, but he also had an impact on filmmakers.
Yeah, and I absolutely love when, culture starts eating itself. So I think that is a delightful thing. This is why I love talking to people smarter than me. I did not know that was the first piece acquired by MoMA. So thank you. I'm learning something too.
I'm learning a lot today too. This is great.
So now, after a little bit of a break, I do want to get into Hopper's most famous piece, Nighthawks. But before I do the cut to ads, I want to tell you about another great podcast for history lovers. It's called Calm History. If you want to learn about fascinating moments in history in the most relaxing way possible, try Calm History. Each episode is narrated in a calm voice to help you relax or even fall asleep. You'll learn about famous explorers, leaders, inventions, civilizations, and ancient wonders. Just search for Calm History on your favorite podcast player or tap the link in the show notes. Now I am back with Julie Averbach, the author of the forthcoming book, The Art of Trader Joe's. And I pulled you on, admittedly, kind of last minute for this one because I saw that you had Nighthawks in your book, and I knew you would be up for the challenge of talking about this piece. So just right off the bat, as we're looking at it, what jumps out at you?
Yeah, I mean, what makes an impression on me right away is how quiet and still this painting is. This is a painting of an all-night diner on a New York City street corner, and yet it doesn't have any of the, motion and color and lights that we associate with New York, the city that never sleeps. It feels really eerie and bare. The streets are empty. There's not a single person walking or a piece of litter on the ground. It's not a painting that screams at you with bright and bold colors. It just whispers. It's very subtle.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, the sort of quiet of New York, which is not at all associated with quiet. In some ways, it reminded me of I guess getting back to our previous discussion. It feels to me like a backlot set of New York and not the city itself. There's something I'm getting kind of like uncanny valley vibes with this, where it's just like it's missing something. And anyone who's been to New York, or really any major city, knows that you never see the sidewalk this empty. And it's, as you said, not only devoid of people, it's devoid of litter, it's devoid of cars, it's so barren. And I think for those of us of a certain age, we can remember the social distancing, the isolation in 2020. But what I found was interesting, the world event happening when he painted this was completed just a little bit after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And something that I hadn't realized until I was much older. Like, you always hear about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. A lot of people don't know that, the Nazis, there was a botched effort to make landfall and invade the US. There was a lot of tension, a lot of fear in the air. And New York was worried about the potential of air raids, the way that London was dealing with it. And really all of Europe was dealing with it. But they would have like blackout drills where they would dim the lights in the city, and people would be inside. And so this sort of dark, desolate city, in some ways, that was a reality for at least some occasions for him. Although, from what I've read, people immediately started to try to find, like, where was this diner? And it was from his head. I mean, there were some studies, but there's not this specific location and this diner to be found in the city.
Right. I think that's very typical of Hopper's process, because he was a really keen observer of New York City. He would often go around sketching. He would go on late night walks, sit on park benches for hours, ride public transit in loops, and just sketch and observe, and then bring all of his sketches back to his studio, where he would create these composites that are part reality and part imagination. So I think that's what we're seeing here, that it is a somewhat realistic painting, but it also has some kind of surreal quality to it, as if out of a dream.
The other thing that like really strikes me is just the angles of this, the viewpoint, this composition. I don't think I ever would have come up with. And I think it's because if you look at the left half, at least the viewer's left from the viewer's side, outside the diner, it feels like there's a lot of empty space. He's emphasizing that empty city street, but then the glow of the neon lights in the diner and everything like that, it pulls our attention there. But if that's the focal point, it in some ways feels frustrating to me that I'm looking through the window. I'm not in the diner with them. You know what I mean? And
I do.
And that that isolation, that I like, that's a Hopper in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the painting is very dark overall, but then we have this one source of light, this fluorescent light coming from the diner. And I agree with you. I think the light, for me, feels like an invitation to enter inside the painting. It's also interesting that when it comes to the plate glass window, Hopper doesn't really paint the actual glass. We're not seeing much of a reflection or a glare. So we have this clear, unobstructed view that really lures us into this diner. And then you remember that there is this glass boundary that's separating you from the people inside. And so you're always on the outside looking in. There's this kind of push and pull effect where you're feeling invited into the painting, but then you're also physically shut out where there's no door into this diner and it's impossible for you to enter inside.
Yeah, I mean it feels in some ways almost like torturous, where it's like I can see it, but it's just out of reach. And that feels like the kind of worst social feeling out there. Like it's like knowing the party's happening, but you didn't get the invite, you know? Um, I feel like there's something about the human experience and like the isolation. And I think what I find most interesting is as you look at this piece, even the couple, assuming it's a couple, on first glance, you see a man and a woman sitting together, and it looks like they're holding hands. But then as you look more carefully, you see their hands are separated. You see that they're not looking at each other. There's this slight difference. She's looking at something in her hands. He's looking just straight ahead, stone-faced. And actually, that man sitting there is where the name Nighthawks came from. I guess Joe looked at him and said that he had a nose like a hawk's beak, and that's where the title of this piece comes from. But I think it's so interesting how like even people who are together are isolated here. A little bit cold, a little bit distant. Or maybe that's just me. Maybe that's just because that's not how I interact with my family, my loved ones. We're the type of people who hug when we when we see each other somewhere. We hug when we say goodbye. But there's something off-putting to me about this.
I agree. I mean, I can see in this painting, especially when we consider the backdrop of World War II, a sense of loneliness, of disconnection, maybe anxiety about the future, that there are these four people physically gathered together in this diner, and yet they're not interacting with each other. And each person seems absorbed in their own thoughts and their own world. I could even imagine, a contemporary version of this painting where these people inside the diner are all on their cell phones. Like, I think there's something that really resonates with us today about these questions of isolation and alienation. And in a 2024 context, thinking about how technology now alienates us from one another. So there are these kind of deeper human themes to what Hopper is painting, that although this painting is a product of the 1940s, there is something about those questions of isolation and the difficulties of being present with one another that continue to speak to us now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting parallel with the way that phones and social media and garbage podcasts create this illusion of connection, but it's not satisfying the same way that sitting down in person and like that genuine human connection can be. I mean, there's some value to it, I hope. And if you agree, please make sure you're leaving a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. But I think you're right. Like a contemporary version of this, they would be sitting there on their phones. In Hopper's day, we see them, there's maybe like a newspaper folded up. They're, the cigarette in their hand, which really dates this piece. But I think there is something in some ways sadly timeless about that feeling of being isolated and alone despite being physically with other people. Just being physically present is not the same as feeling connected with people, I guess, is the way I'm thinking of. Is that what you were getting at with that?
Totally. I mean, I think it's a common experience in the city, this idea of being in a crowd of people and yet feeling by yourself. But just to play devil's advocate here a little bit, I think there's also a more optimistic reading that we might take from this painting. We could also consider this diner as a beacon of light and hope, a place where these four people are gathered together, and whether they are strangers or not, whether they interact directly or not, that they might feel some comfort and some camaraderie just being in each other's company despite the darkness and uncertainty of the world around them. So I think that's the kind of flip side of this. And maybe it's just because I love diners, but I feel something kind of cozy about this lit space where these people are gathered together, set against the darkness of the world outside.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid interpretation. I mean, there is a little bit of a warmth to the light, and they're sitting at a counter where it is not uncommon for people to go out and be like, okay, I'm going to sit at the counter and I'm going to strike up a conversation with the people around me at the diner or the bar or whatever place you happen to be inhabiting. It can be a social space, and I think that's kind of the genius of Hopper in his compositions. There's enough left to us as the viewer. There's enough room for us to make the interpretation. He's hinting at a narrative, and it's like a psychological test to see, like, what are we seeing in this work? It's reflecting a little bit of our own lens and our own biases back towards us. And I think that's really interesting because it is in some ways very specific and concrete in the depiction, and yet still so open to other connections and interpretations.
Yeah, I agree.
That's a hard thing to pull off. That's a hard thing to do. He's walking that tightrope quite well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really ambiguous painting, and I think it leaves us with more questions than it does answers. It refuses to resolve itself in any one meaning. And I think even Hopper himself, when people would approach him and ask him, what does this painting, what is this all about? What does it mean? He resisted that because he felt that the artwork spoke for themselves, and he wanted to leave it more open for us to interpret. So these are, questions that might never be answered, probably will never be answered. But I think, part of the joy is in asking these questions and kind of dreaming up these different scenarios of who these people might be, what brings them here, how they might relate to one another.
Yeah. And earlier, I kind of took the less charitable view of Hopper with my frustration over my impression that he was not supportive of Joe in the way that I would have liked to have seen. But what I will say I appreciate about that little insight is I like when an artist says, I'm not going to give you what it has to mean, because realistically speaking, the artist's interpretation, I don't want to say it's not valid, but I feel like we make a mistake when we perceive the artist's word as the final word on it, because if they're putting it out for the public to view and consume, it should be a dialogue. What the viewer brings to the work, I think, is almost equally important as what the painter puts on the canvas, because that's where the art becomes relevant. It's that moment when viewers start to make connections and interpretations and find meaning in it, because otherwise it should just be something for the artists to make for themselves and their own personal satisfaction. To wrap it up now, I always ask people the most awkward possible question. Where does this belong? Is this one for the Louvre? Is this one for the lab for us to study and learn from, whether we like it or not? Or is this one for the loo?
I could see this painting in a lot of places. I feel like my ideal place to see this would be in my local diner, because I love when, art imitates life, life imitates art. But the painting is more accessible when it's in a museum. So I'm going to say that the Art Institute of Chicago can keep it for now, and we'll let this stay in the museum where we can all appreciate it and interpret it for ourselves.
Okay, so Julie Averbach going on the record. She's not going to steal from the Art Institute. um, I, yeah, I reluctantly agree. Usually I try to find a way to disagree with people about stuff, but I really do. I do think this needs to be out and seen by people. I think there's a lot to see and appreciate. It's aesthetically pleasing, but it also is revelatory. And the more time you spend looking at it, the more you discover.
Well, I love the idea of, sitting with the painting, that the same way that there's a sense of timelessness within the work. And, these diners are sitting at this counter for who knows how long. That's how we should approach this painting, from this calm, contemplative state where we can, spend hours and hours and still dream up new meanings and new interpretations for it.
Yeah, and there's no better note to end on than that. So I'm just going to say thank you once again, Julie Averbach, author of The Art of Trader Joe's and the founder and CEO of Smarty. Smarty.biz. The link's going to be in the show notes for anyone who wants a virtual tour of some lovely museums and learn more from someone smarter than me. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you so much. It was really an honor to be here, and I learned a lot from you. So thanks so much.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.